How we doing this morning? It's a Sunday, rainy morning here in Elgin, Minnesota. We're 2 days from election. There's a real palpable fear, I think. In both sides of the aisle, to be honest. Uh, let's just hope for a peaceful election day and uh, hope for the best. I mean, I'm certainly not that optimistic about a peaceful day. It's scary times, to be honest, a little bit here in America. The outrage and the vitriol from two camps who really aren't economically as far apart as they think they are, philosophically and economically, ideologically. The American economic fabric exists both right of center in a global sense. The liberals in America are left of the Republicans, but they're not left of center in the European sense. So the Democrats and Republicans fiscally are both not that removed from each other. It's the social issues, the religious zealotry, the bigoted, small-minded fear-mongering that has the rural and urban fabric so divided, and the racism that is being fomented, the fear of immigrants and minorities. Jazz lived in that. Jazz breathed that. Jazz emoted and improvised to cope with that. As an immigrant myself from Canada, but not really grasping, because white English speaking male, I mean, we're not really the target of a whole lot of prejudice in spite of what some people would have you believe and think. But still, I hear talk of immigrants, and I'm just, obviously what the Republicans fear is the urban growth of the country, those trends, those dynamics, that immigration is all urban. The people who go from the colleges and the small towns and immigrate to the cities. The urbanization of America is almost irreversible. And to paint a picture of fear and hate and war zones is trying to prevent their eroding demographic from disappearing. It's not the white American Christian that's under threat. It's the small-minded, bigoted, prejudicial fool who votes for the Republican Party that's under threat. And if you're a fiscal conservative, more power to you. I don't have a problem with fiscal conservatism. I understand those precepts. I mean, you should be wealthy to have those concepts in the fore of your brain. But the idea that the left in America is some kind of socialist, communist, juggernaut, Marxist is ridiculous. The left is as corporate and as wound up in a lot of its business agenda. And the American economy is such a much bigger thing that either political party has control over. The U.S. economy is a huge container ship that the captain can change it a degree or two, but it's still heading to the same port of destination. And this fear of immigrants is a fear of more democratic voters who come from places where democracy actually exists and functions, and who recognize that, services for people are what government's supposed to provide, and that deregulating industry is not what freedom is supposed to mean. That being said, I mean, it's a scary time, and you see fear at the forefront of so much of the political agenda and mindset. That's what's at the fore. And, I mean, way too many people on both sides, really, don't really understand a lot of the economic principles that they are endearing. They understand some of the social stuff, some of the religious stuff, but religion and politics should not be interwoven. I mean, it's not the place of the church to be involved with government. The church has had enough governance over the centuries and the destruction that's caused. I mean, if you think that Christian prayer should be okay in school, but other religious prayers shouldn't be, that's prejudicial as it gets. And human earthling is who your empathy should extend towards. I've said it many times. And shame on us for falling for a rhetoric that's as dangerous and as divisive and as hate-filled and as rooted ignorance as it is. Most of the people I know who are afraid of gay, trans, black, Muslim, Jew, Russian, Chinese don't really know a whole lot about those groups. And so the fear and the disinformation that they hear can dehumanize those groups, when the fact of the matter is they're the same as you. They want their kids home safe at night. They want love. They want their bills paid, their dishes cleaned. They're not this disparate section of humanity that's trying to oppress you. That's not how human lives function. It's about survival. And many of these groups who are coming here through immigration are trying to survive, in part because bigger geopolitics and economics have upended the life in their home country, whether it be Guatemala, Nicaragua, Venezuela. I mean, there's Haiti. The unstable economics of those countries is often rooted in the policies of the big brother on the block. And again, that stuff, the geopolitics of larger multinational corporations functions and exists beyond the scope of the American left and right in the political voting process. That stuff doesn't really change who we're dropping bombs on and drone strikes. And I mean, the president doesn't really have much influence on that. Obama found that out. Trump found that out. Anyway, but jazz reflects fear. Jazz reflects oppression. Jazz reflects living in troubled times. And so jazz is never more poignant and powerful than in troubled times. You really understand where it comes from. And I'm going to start off by talking about one of my favorite album covers in jazz history. It's such a cool cover. And it's one of those weird Savoy titles that didn't really have a leader chosen for it. It's called Night People. It's Savoy 12073. And it's from probably 1957 or 58. And the great melting pot of New York City, the Times Square. What a great cover that is, the old Pepsi sign. I mean, I just love New York in the 50s. The center of the world in so many concepts, whether economics, politics, baseball, music, media, advertising. New York was the fulcrum point of so many things. This comes from two different sessions, and I don't think it was ever a 10-inch stuff. I think it was possibly, I mean, it could have been. I don't know the Savoy 10-inch discography as well as some. But it's the combos of Mort Herbert, or Hebert, however it's said. I'm going to go with Hebert, Mort Hebert, because it's definitely a French name. He was a great bass player, a white cat who played in a lot of sessions on the East Coast, led some groups. And one of the things I want to drive home in this episode is the infinite sea of jazz players who have slipped into obscurity today. And I'm working on my trading card jazz series cards again, and I'm getting close to having being done. I got burned out for a while and I stopped, but it's almost 700 cards, 700 bios that I've written, 700 pieces of information I've stacked together on all these different players. Most of them had either albums as leaders on the great labels throughout the jazz era, or at least were sidemen on enough sessions that they were validated to have a card. And I keep finding other guys. I'm like, man, it'd be nice to give this guy a card too. But I mean, I'm almost at 700 cards right now, which is a lot. But there's another record coming up here I'm going to show you in a minute. I'll actually pull it out next, which will drive that point home even more. But, I mean, Mort Hebert did quite a few Savoy sessions. Probably not nearly as many as Wendell Marshall on bass, but he was on some sessions. He's playing with a mixed group here. We've got the great trumpet player Joe Wilder on some of these tracks. Bobby Jasper, the Belgian. Dick Katz. Kenny Clark's on the drums, who again's on so many Savoy sessions. Sahib Shihab's on some of this. Mort Kuzo, Kenny Clark again. Don Stratton's on trumpet on some of this. Sahib Shihab again on the sax. Ronnie Ball on the piano, the great British piano player. So some interesting sessions by some interesting players in the 50s. But yet it's completely beautiful stuff. And you could play this next to some early 50s Miles, and you wouldn't have a hard time knowing which is which. I mean, the quality of these musicians and the playing, it's top of the mark. And you did not get into these studios in these days without being able to really play. I mean, you can make music today with a cell phone, sample a phone ringing, and sample, and there's just so little musicality in so much of music today. In these days, to even get tape pressed and recorded, you were a player. And these guys are all pretty big names in jazz at the time, and most of them have slipped into fairly obscure roles today. Kenny Clark's probably the most established name, along with Saeed Shihab and maybe Joe Wilder. But Wilder's definitely a second, third, fourth strum player in today's reference. And then the guys like Hall and Kuzo and Dick Katz, Jasper, they've all kind of slipped fairly into obscurity. But what a cool cover. Beautiful session. I'm a huge Joe Wilder fan. He's one of the great forgotten trumpet players of this era. Played with Basie, played with others. His recordings, he has a couple on Columbia, honestly, which shows you how big a name he was at one point. But he certainly slipped into irrelevance today. Next, I'm going to talk to you about Lionel Hampton. This was a Clef title originally, number 670. And then eventually got a Verve 8019 reissue. And so 54, maybe 55 was a 670 title. And then probably in 56 it got reissued as Verve 8019. I'm pretty sure I had the same cover in both. And Lionel Hampton, big band, orchestra, traveled around a lot, traveling band. And Hampton's one of the greatest players in jazz. I mean, he's just an incredible, dynamic revelation on the vibraphone. Benny Goodman had his socks blown off by him, and that's why they recorded those quartet sessions with Krupa and Teddy Wilson in the late 30s. Hampton was just unheard of on that instrument before him, kind of like Jimmy Smith was on the organ in 55. Like, the people are like, what the hell is this? And the vibraphone wasn't really a jazz instrument before Lionel Hampton. And Hampton's virtuosity is really unrivaled. But aside from Basie and Ellington, Hampton and Dizzy Gillespie in the 50s and the late 40s were two of the great, Billy Eckstine as well in that same era, were two or three of the great black big bands that were still kind of traveling and working and were proving grounds, training grounds, universities for the young black jazz musicians to come up and cut their teeth. And Hampton had his ear to the ground. He was always scouting talent. He was always bringing black and white talent into his groups. And the amount of guys on my trading cards who either played with Hampton or Gillespie or both, and Eckstein as well, really. I mean, those three orchestras are really kind of forgotten today, especially in comparison to the legend of Basie and then and the reign of Ellington. Those guys really kind of reigned supreme. But what Woody Herman and Stan Kenton were to the 40s and 50s in the big band white orchestras, Hampton and Gillespie and Eckstein were that to the black orchestras in that same era. And so many of the cats that ended up in the Blue Notes and the Prestiges and the Riversides and the Savoys worked, if you're African American, you worked with Eckstein, you worked with Dizzy, you worked with Lionel Hampton. And so Hampton really was a great proving ground, a training ground for so much young talent to come through. And he's one of the great leaders. And he taught them how to be men. And Dizzy did this as well. He taught them how to be men and businessmen and have acumen and how to handle yourself and how to face racism, how to deal with segregation, how to carry yourself in the face of all that. And so there's a lot of manhood teaching that comes with being with a great leader. And Eckstein and Hampton and Dizzy were all great leaders. They were leaders of young men, and how to teach them how to be men themselves and how to go out and lead their own groups eventually. And the number of legendary people that came through Hampton's band is fairly incredible. But this traveling band was a band he was touring with in probably 54. And as knowledgeable as I am of jazz, which, I mean, I put myself in the upper ranks, this band he's working with here is completely anonymous. And it just goes to show you the size and the dimension of the ocean of players that existed. I mean, everyone learned how to play instruments in school. And jazz was the cool hip music of the 30s and the 40s and the 50s. And so there was no DJ services. You had big bands working everywhere. And so black and white kids were growing up learning how to play jazz because it was the funnest, most danceable, most sexual, coolest thing you could be if you were a musician. Playing in a symphony was, that was fine. But man, mom and dad don't like that jazz. I want to play some of that. And that's a powerful thing in culture, always kind of separating yourself from the roots of your parents. And so I'm just going to read you off some of the names of this group here. And you have Lionel Hampton, of course, in the Vibes. And then tell me how many other names you guys know once we get past. And even your Scott Baldwins and Jean-Michel Reeser Beethovens. How many of these guys do you guys know? Because, Peter Beatty on the bass. Never heard of him. Jim Arick on the alto. Never heard of him. Bob Plater on the alto and clarinet. Never heard of him. Eddie Chambly on the tenor. I do know Eddie Chambly. He had some records on Emersy. So there's a guy I'm familiar with. But most people don't know Eddie Chambly. Retney Braver, tenor saxophone. Never heard of Retney Braver. Joseph Evans, baritone saxophone. Joe Evans. Maybe heard that guy's name before. Edward Preston, trumpet. Eddie Preston. Name doesn't really ring a bell. Wallace Davenport, trumpet. Don't know. Julius Brooks, trumpet. Great name. Don't know him. Sounds like a linebacker, doesn't he? Edward Mullins, trumpet. Elvin Hayes, trombone. And I know Elvin Hayes, but the Elvin Hayes I know was a great basketball player for the San Diego Rockets and the Washington Bullets. Arnett Spano, trombone. Harold Roberts, trombone. Some of these names sound vaguely familiar, but Willie Ruff, French horn. Dwight with a K. Dwight Mitchell, piano. John Mackle on the guitar. Rufus Jones on the drums. And Isavro Hernandez on the Congo drum. Isavro, that's a great name. Isavro Hernandez on the Congo. So, it's a big group, big horn section, a lot of bright moving, well-oiled machine. You play with Hampton, you got some chops. But I think it helps really reveal just how big the universe of jazz was. That of those 14, 15 names I mentioned, even myself, with a 700 card trading card series that I've written and done, don't know this guy. So yeah, traveling band. It's a cooking record. You'd think all obscure names these guys aren't going to be able to play, but there's some playing on that record. It's pretty fantastic. The next record I'm going to put on here in a little bit, and I love this record. Another Savoy, 12072, which I think puts it right next to the Night People record, 12073. So this came out right before that other record did on Savoy. North, South, East, West. And that's the great Frank Wess you see there. It's a cool cover. For graphic design, Savoy wasn't great. This is pretty good for them. It's kind of their artwork is never very forward. Frank Wess had a long, talented career, well-established, high-respected, played multiple instruments, clarinet, flute. I think he played alto and tenor, if I remember. But led some of the rhythm section, horn sections and bassies groups for a while. And he's playing here with pretty much Basie alone. Frank Wess, Frank Foster, Henry Coker, Benny Powell, Kenny Burrell, Eddie Jones, and Kenny Clark. And of those, I'm not sure Burrell ever played with Basie, and I'm not sure Kenny Clark played with Basie, but very Basie-heavy group here. The trombones, the horns, saxophones, the bass player. There's a lot of Basie faculty going on here. And again, that's where a lot of these guys were coming from. Either the Herman Kenton groups and the white labels, or the great big bands in the black community were getting these small group recording sessions. So this is on the Savoy label. Again, probably 57. Looks like it might be a promo copy. Promotional, not for sale. Cool. Great session, great stuff. Pretty cool cover. He's a great player with a lot of blues, a lot of gospel in his sound. He's not one of those over players. He's a lyrical player. He sings with his instruments and gives you wonderful emoting. A great stylist. Now, a record that caught me a bit off guard when I put it on the other day was this Chet Baker on Riverside, Chet in New York. And sometimes the people you get on a record will be dictated by the label they're recording for, and who else is on that label at that time. And so, like, we have these guys both under contract, let's put them together in the studio. And you actually end up with a pairing here that caught me a little off guard. I hadn't listened to this in quite a long time. And again, when you have 15,000 records and 7,000 jazz records plus, records sometimes go out of circulation for a while. And I love Baker. I'm not a huge fan of his singing, but I love his playing. And what you find here is Baker in a fairly aggressive setting, a fairly up-tempo setting. He's got two brothers on the bass and the drums, and Philly Joe Jones and Paul Chambers. And so right off the bat, he's not playing in his West Coast cool white ensemble. He's playing with some East Coast brothers. And then Al Haig on the piano, which is an interesting addition there. And Haig wasn't really a Riverside guy. Haig wasn't really a West Coast guy. He was more rooted in East Coast bebop. And I mean, he's done some interesting sessions over the years, Haig. But what's the real surprise on this session is the tenor player is the great Johnny Griffin. And I would almost certainly guess that it was Griffin working for Riverside at this point that put those two on cross paths. And boy, will I say that Griffin, who is a nimble, we talked about him last episode, nimble, dexterous, acrobatic, furious player, could play at fast, lightning tempos, nimble, Chicago-bred, stylist. I mean, Griffin's one of the great tenor players of that era. And his influence is definitely Charlie Parker definitely influenced who Johnny Griffin was. And Griffin can play, boy. Griffin's, I mean, he can play beautifully and lyrically, but he's also just a dynamic soloist and just has all kinds of expression and ferocious ferocity. And so he impacts Baker here in quite a way, where you hear Baker in a more aggressive, flashier, less cloudy, less muted, less diminished, less sanguine setting. So you hear Baker actually in a fairly near hard bop setting, which is fun. It's fun. And I mean, you're going to hear Baker mostly in the cool. He's a cool guy. He was in that cool school. And part of what makes cool is the experience of being white in America. I mean, you can play with the same tempo and aggression, but at best you're doing cool bop. You're not doing hard bop. So tempo there's more to it than that. It's the emoting quality of what you're expressing and what your condition and experiences have to say that helps create the aggression and the tension and then the ferocity that hard bop is. That's the most important dynamic of hard bop, is the venting of my experiences. That's what jazz is. It's emoting via improvisation. And so I think people so often lose that key ingredient. It's not about the keys and the scales and the numbers and the notes. It's not about the genre and the style. It's about improvising my emotional condition. And different eras and different pockets of history produce different dynamics. A black man in the Jim Crow era was trying to be cordial and create a bridge between white and black America and trying to shake hands and extend and forgive and move forward. The Armstrongs, the Ellingtons, the Basies, you could feel it throughout that generation. The post-war regression of men dying in overseas, coming back for no freedom in America still, and heroin riddling their neighborhoods, creates this new aggression in black America of no more. And it's tangible. It's what creates bebop and hard bop and this changing dynamic and aggression and ferocity that just fuels the art. And so again, when we try to separate politics and jazz and history and extricate them from each other, you lose all sense of bearing, all sense of meaning. It becomes devoid of what it is. It's like hearing Nas and the Wu-Tang and not understanding what it's like to live in the Bronx, Harlem, and Staten Island. It's really, in Queens, pardon me, Nas. I mean, it's really important to have that history in that context to graft meaning. And so when you put a Chet Baker, who comes from, a pained experience, I think the guy struggled with depression and anxiety. He definitely had his romantic issues and was trouble with women. He definitely had an awful drug problem. He was a dour counter to Miles Davis in a white set of skin. A negative embodiment of a lot of expression comes through Chet Baker's playing. So it's not like he was devoid of struggle. But that's a different struggle than if I go out today, am I going to get shot, go to jail, never get released for something I might not even have done? That's a different emotional struggle. That's a different weight on your shoulder than the struggle of mental health, which is real, but it's not the same as the oppression. You don't get time to deal with mental health when just getting home tonight safely is on the front of your plate. You don't get to them peas in the back corner. You're still dealing with that gravy up front that's taking all your energy to deal with. And so hearing Baker in an East Coast setting with three brothers, Chambers, Philly Joe, and Johnny fucking Griffin, it puts Baker in a different light. And you can hear it in his playing. And I'll be honest, I put it on, I'm like, yeah, I remember this while I was playing it. I'm like, man, he's coming with some fire today. What's this? What's going on here? And jazz does reveal itself if you listen with the right ears. If you have the empathy and the historical context, you can actually hear things and be like, oh, Baker's got some agitation going on here. Who's he playing with? And you know it's on Riverside, so you know it's an East Coast session. But then you see Johnny Griffin, you're like, oh. You see Philly Joe and Paul Chambers, you're like, oh. And so to try to pretend that race and history and the dynamics of that story aren't a part of the jazz narrative, I can say with great confidence, if that's your take, you ain't hearing a thing, motherfucker. You ain't hearing nothing. You missing the entire script. Start over, go back to the beginning, stick with your John McLaughlin and your fucking bitches brew and thinking you know something. Because if you don't recognize that the racial history of this country is being reflected in that music as it was happening in live time. These are live broadcasts, motherfucker. You're watching the actual headlines of the men who experienced this history. Because jazz isn't some written thing where you're like, I want to write carefully. It's especially how I feel right the fuck now. There's an immediacy to it. The danger is imminent, and it's coming through my fucking horn. And I get pushback at times from people that, oh, jazz and history, making jazz about politics. It's not about politics per se and voting, but it's about the politics and the history of race and tyranny and oppression. And it just has to be said, like it or not. And if you want further proof of what I'm saying, this record will counterpoint that wonderfully. Corky fucking Hale, a wonderful harpist, pianist. I can't remember if she sings or not. She might sing on some of this. No, Hale, harp, piano, and flute. There was some vocal on this if I remember. She might sing on a number or two. I can't recall. Some great stuff on here. And it's on the Gene Norman Presents GNP label out of the West Coast. And in spite of the great song selections, April in Paris, London in July, Cabin in the Sky, But Not For Me, Autumn in New York, Foggy Day, there's plenty of room here for emotional emoting. But what you get is a very light-hearted, white American, soft experience. In spite of there being some great tempos and some really fun songs, and you have the great Buddy Collette on the flute and the tenor, who's probably leading and arranging a lot of this stuff. Larry Bunker on the vibes, Howard Roberts on the guitar, Red Mitchell on bass, and Chico Hamilton. And so you actually have three brothers in there, but they're West Coast brothers. They're part of a different scene and culture. They're not part of that East Coast hard bop thing, really. And then you have Bobby Envoltson on he's playing bass on this? Weird. And Don Heath on the drums on some of the numbers. Howard Roberts, I love Howard Roberts' guitar. But these sessions feel led by Corky and Howard Roberts, and of course Buddy Collette probably has a big influence, but you never got a lot of sense of political, social dynamics out of Buddy Collette. He felt very Cool red vinyl on the GNP label. But I mean, there's a huge gulf between the aggression of East Coast hard bop and those players and what was happening on the West Coast. And it's not to say racism wasn't real on the West Coast, because it was. LA was very segregated and very prejudicial, and some of the things that were happening on the West Coast were as difficult as on the East Coast, and with a much smaller population to back up your demographic. Wonderful record here by the great Ben Webster, king of the tenors, Ben Webster, one of the three great tenor players, of course, in jazz history, along with Coleman Hawkins and Lester Young. I mean, those three are the architects of the instrument, and there's hundreds of great tenor players, but every one of them has one of those three that dominates how they play. And sometimes you have a mix of all three of them in your playing. And Webster tends to lean closer to Lester in their tonality, but Webster's breathiness, his soft embouchure, his emoting. Again, Webster's from a bit of an older generation, so he's more of a bridge building kind of guy who had the demons of his own and struggled with alcoholism, struggled with weight. But boy, I love Ben Webster. He's one of my favorite musicians. I love his storytelling, the narration of his script. His soul and his spirit speaks through it. And he might tell you a bit of a sloppy tale at times in terms of sitting on his knee because he's got some whiskey in that blood. But boy, can he ever tell you a story. And boy, you have a hard time not feeling it. This was a Norgran title initially, Norgran 1001. And it was reissued as 8020 in the verb sequence, probably in 56, which means I want to pull out the Norgran cover real quick. So this was the original cover on Norgran. It's Norgran 1001, so it's the second title in the Norgran LP sequence, and it did have a 10-inch sequence prior. I don't think this had a 10-inch edition. This was LP material, so probably from 55, maybe 54. And so the black and white cover gets replaced by the color cover a short 2 years later, 2.5 years later. And again, for those who don't know, Norman Grand's owned Clef, he owned Norgran, and then he signs Ella Fitzgerald and he consolidates both those labels into a new label, Verve. So Norgran and Clef are the roots of Verve. And most of the important recordings, if not all, of the Norgran Clef stuff did get repackaged in the first couple hundred titles on the Verve label. It's a convoluted universe, but probably the most important jazz label that ever existed, because he calls together all the great talent, both black and white, but predominantly black America, and puts them together in these working groups in the Jazz and the Philharmonic. And I've told you the Verve story many times. But Ben Webster's one of those icons. He's one of those legends. And he played with Ellington. He played with Basie. I mean, I'm a huge Webster guy. And sometimes I like to see the cross-reference just for my own memory, I thought this was actually a different cover in my memory than it was. I can see why they gave this one a new issue. Neither of them are David Stone Martin, obviously. Then a couple West Coast titles here. Paul Togawa, a drummer from the West Coast, Japanese, American, on the Mode label, with Gabe Balthazar, Dick Johnson, and Ben Tucker. Again, names that are kind of, Ben Tucker is somewhat known. Dick Johnson on piano, I think he might have an Atlantic session. Gabe Balthazar on the alto, a name I don't know very well. Of course, Paul Togawa probably had a fairly decent legacy in Japan, I'm guessing, as a drummer. But this is on the Mode label, number 104, which is a pretty early, I guess it's a third or fourth title. I can't remember if it starts at 100 or 101. But it's a pretty early Mode issuing. The Mode covers all have the same paintings for the first 10, 12 titles. Great record, honestly. It's a nice session. West Coast, it was cool. And then a really fun record here, again on the Mode label, number 106. And I showed this one not too long ago, but I wanted to hear it again. Clora Bryant, gal with a horn. The gal is a fierce, small woman in stature, but fierce in her tone and her playing and her personality even. It comes across, and she sings on some of this, and you can just tell that she's just not easily intimidated. Recorded in Hollywood in 1957. It's got the blueprint on the back revealing it's an old pressing. Here playing with Roger Fleming, Ben Tucker, Buzz Freeman, and then Walter Benton and Normie Faye show up on some of it as well. So this is a fairly black session here for a label that doesn't do a lot of African American recording. Really, she's fierce. I'm not gonna lie. And some of the songs on here, "Gypsy in My Soul," "This Can't Be Love." I mean, she's no joke. She's a trumpet player. She's absolutely intense. You can tell she's always in a place where she has to prove herself. And as a black man had always proved himself in a white-dominated world, in terms of maintaining their freedom, a woman always has to retain her sense of self in a male-dominated jazz music world. And so she faces the double-sided obstacles of being a black woman. And male chauvinism has no racial boundary. And so both men in both races always would... there was less opportunity for women in the music, for sure. And you really had to be a pretty outstanding player to maintain any kind of career or legacy in this music. The last record I want to talk about today is Verve 8021, which means this probably has a clef counterpart, which I haven't notated here, which is strange. It might not, but again, a session that I instantly recognized Eddie Costa when I heard him. And Costa was a bad boy, and I've talked about Costa quite a lot even recently, and how his piano playing, that thundering left hand of his, and right hand too, going into those middle octaves on the piano. He does some stuff in those mid to low ranges that just sets him apart. And there's probably few players in jazz that I can more instantly be like, oh, that must be Eddie Costa. Because it's such a trademark thing that he does. Playing virtuistic, middle range, thundering, just rolling things that are just, it's Eddie Costa. There's nothing else you can really describe it as. So he again was on this. And three really incredible players here. Tal, whose nickname was the Octopus because he had these giant hands, allowing him to make chord structures and frames that most players couldn't even tackle. You have the great Vinnie Burke on the bass, who's one of the great bass players in the white combos of this era. He backs the great Chris, she worked for Atlantic in Bethlehem, Chris Connor. He's a part of her backing groups for quite a while. He has a couple records as a leader at Bethlehem. And Bethlehem, one of their tricks was signing bass players as leaders and then getting their affiliated musicians on those sessions to get some of those other players out recording for Bethlehem, because bass players very rarely had their own leadership contracts. So there's quite a few bass players who got sessions as leaders at Bethlehem, including Milt Hinton, including Charlie Mingus. All the Mingus stuff was actually recorded for Leonard Feather at Period. There's probably, I think, 5 or 6. Max Bennett had sessions as a leader. It's quite a long list of bass players that got sessions at Bethlehem. But Tal is just a wonderful, this plastic's kind of covering off on that, a wonderful player. I can't recall if it had a clef reissue. But I mean, not a reissue, but a clef forebear, I should say. But that wraps up today's episode. And those of you who think politics and jazz don't belong in the same conversation, I just don't know what to say to you guys. Just don't know what to say. And you're the ultimate propagandists and brainwash. You are sweeping under the carpet an art form that is factually stating freedom in spite of its tyranny and oppression. And it's not a remote connection. It's not a distant whisper of resistance. It's a strong, steady stream of black liberation that's being expressed by black musicians, and often being completely voiced and reinforced by the white musicians who they were friends with. White musicians empathized with their black musician friends. I mean, music brought race together really before athletics did. And whereas athleticism has really helped bridge in a broader sense in the 20th century, music was the forebear to that. And you kind of get away from that in the rock and roll era, which I think allowed athletics to take over that. But even the early rock and roll era, from the Beatles and the Stones to Elvis, they were all doing black music. They just weren't really playing together necessarily. But, I mean, in the 40s and the 50s, everyone from Armstrong to the beboppers to the hard boppers, they were bridging that racial gap and playing together and empathizing with each other and sharing needles. I mean, it was literally a crazy time. And to separate any art from the history that art is made in is to stop understanding that art. And I'll say it over and over and over again. It's just never going to not be part of what I'm trying to get across here, is that the art is always a reflection of the time that it's being created. Whether you're talking about Shakespeare, whether you're talking about Tom Sawyer, whether you're talking about 1812 Overture, whether you're talking about the jazz music, whether you're talking about the blues, it's just, if it's not talking directly about it, it's having a response to it that's helping them cope with it. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want wasn't written in celebration. It wasn't written in victory. It was written in occupation, slavery, and tyranny. The Old Testament was a story of an occupied, enslaved people under the thumb of every power that existed in the Levant and the Middle East, and even Anatolia, from the Hittites to the Persians to the, you go on down that list. The Egyptians, the Romans, the Assyrians, they all kicked those Canaanites' asses over, and the Philistines. Every one of those stories is talking about the powerful empire that existed over off the Euphrates, over off the Tigris, over in Anatolia, over in Egypt, and how they were often brought into slavery and taken into captivity or in bondage or paying tribute to. There's very little celebration of the great chapters of Israeli history in the Old Testament. And it's arguable that that time that did exist is mythological. There's people who want to say that King Solomon and King David led Israel during this golden era, but then there should be more legacy of that time when they were a great ruling people. There should be more cross-reference in other history books, but there's so little history that shows Solomon's temple even existed, or they were anything but a small tribal people who maybe had found a sense of independence and were glorifying that moment of freedom when they kind of escaped someone else's tyranny. Maybe another empire had collapsed around them. So they had this moment of independence, and it becomes glamorized in their own traditional and oral text. And they start to remember the time of David and Solomon as this great time, but they weren't never the rulers of that region. They just weren't. When Joshua marches into Canaan, they slaughtered all the women and children and the livestock of the Canaanites and quickly stayed at war for 3,000 years and lost most of them. And that scripture is a testament, thus the word, the testaments of a people surviving tyranny, occupation, slavery, hard times. But it's a song, it's a message that resonates throughout time, because that message always has an audience. There's always an oppressed group that can relate to somebody else surviving tyranny. And so if we put the Bible scriptures on our walls and read them and recite them and memorize them thousands of years later, it makes me wonder how anybody could conceivably deny that art is not encapsulating the history that it's made in. And how you can possibly separate the legacy of Black America from the history and the art that it all speaks on. In so many ways, the Bible is validating that very fact. And that's pretty hard to fucking argue. I wish y'all the best. I hope you all have a peaceful and beautiful election day. May clarity and honesty and democracy survive this. The will and the ability for corporations to operate without any inhibition, that it's not freedom. And democracy and government has taken centuries to help regulate industry as much as they have. And not all regulation is probably, but boy, we're on a precipice. We're on a precipice. And so, bottom of my heart, love you all. I appreciate everybody. I hope people who are on the other side of the aisle from me can hear what I'm saying. And if you don't know diversity, maybe recognize that that's partly why the fear and hate mongering works. It's because you're not well versed in other groups. But recognize their humanity, recognize their desperation and their pain. And that they're just trying to make a better life for them and their families. And how can you possibly have empathy for an unborn child and say your religion demands that of you, and not have empathy for a father taking their 5-year-old from an oppressed land of tyranny and desolation and war and starvation and wanting to come here? How can you not have empathy for them if you say you're a religious, spiritual person who has love in your heart? Immigrants are not terrorists and murderers and rapists. In fact, the evidence shows they're some of the most peaceful people who come to this country. Texas keeps records of immigrant crime, and illegal immigrants commit much less crime than regular Americans do. That's the facts. And to be blindsided by a media blitz trying to paint a different story, Joseph Goebbels would be proud. But that's not the side of history you want to be on. Siding with prejudice is not the side of history you want to be on. Trust me. Trust me. Empathy, love, that's where Christ would be. So I implore you, set aside the fear and the hate and turn off the television and recognize the humanity of your fellow human brethren who are just trying to survive and feed their family and find stability. And think of this as a land of promise and resources, and don't recognize how much the people here are unwilling to embrace them. Because we've been convinced that they're why we're struggling too. And yes, we're struggling. Yes, inflation's bad. But it's because the rich have moved so much industry overseas, manufacturing overseas. It's because the rich have destroyed the unions and the middle class. It's not because of the poor. But yet one of the oldest tricks in the book is for the rich to keep the poor divided. And to keep us thinking that the man beneath me is why I can't feed my family. But history shows it's never been the case. And nor is it the case now. It just can't be. If they were that one stealing that apple pie out of your mouths, why are they hungry? Why are they desperate? So again, let love, peace, hope guide your path. And ultimately, that's what's in my heart. I have the world tattooed on my arm because I'm a human. I love my human brethren. My empathy extends to all people on this planet. In America, you need to remember that lesson that we all come from somewhere else. There is no America in the fucking Bible. This is not God's country. We're a nation of people that come from everywhere. And we've all created our mythologies and religions to try to understand what we don't understand, the God of the gaps. And Jesus would want you to love your fellow neighbor, your fellow brethren. It's just the ultimate principle that the man taught was love thy neighbor. Love those you don't know. Treat people with respect and love, no matter what they believe, how they feel, what color they are, where they come from. I wish Jesus could come back here today, get on the microphone and speak on these TV channels and condemn the hate and the fear and show you what love and tolerance and embrace of fellow human looks like. Just ask yourself what Christ would want from you if that's what governs you. Because the man was a man of love. And everything in his teachings and his doctrines emphasizes that infinitely. And to live in fear and hate is the very exact opposite of his doctrine. On that note, I'm going to let you go. Peace, you all. Be safe. Love you all. I mean, I do mean well. I don't want to be divisive. But what has to be said needs to be said, and we need to reconnect to the global community. And the rise of nationalism everywhere is a deafening roar of stupidity. Because nation does not define you. Human earthling does. You are not a Del Monte in a can. You're a tomato in a can. And if you let that label on the can define you more than the ingredients that's within the can, you're fucking being propagated and controlled. And those who control are always those with the wealth and the power who can create an agenda and create a voice for people to be following. I have no dollars to gain here. I'm not trying to benefit financially from my message. In fact, I'm probably diminishing my audience by taking a stance. But it has to be said. Speaking of money, I do need some. It's mortgage time. I got bills to pay. Please support the channel. Please support Patreon. Like the channel, thumbs up, all that stuff. I don't ever say that shit. But we try to be a channel about the music, not about being a YouTuber. I mean, that's not really what I do. I'm not a YouTuber. I'm just a person who talks about history, music, and loves the story and understands the narration behind it and tries to share from that vantage point. And that's why I was pushed into doing this in the first place. I was never the dream of being a YouTuber. The dream was always just, I love this music. Boy, I see it through a different light. It really gives me, and people are like, wow, your vision and how you see it is so unique. Talk about that. And so that's always been what my agenda was, always. Is to make people understand that the history is speaking through these musicians. Powerful stuff. Great day. Talk to you all soon. We love you. Peace.